a very warm welcome to all our viewers and welcome to a new edition of Arab Affairs, our program bringing you all the latest news and events happening around the Arab region and beyond. Today you're in the company of myself, Angie Meher, and of course we begin straight away with a look at some of the news making the headlines, moving to Gaza, where the U.S. charity World Central Kitchen, WCK, on Saturday said that its team had finished unloading almost 200 tons of food, the first shipment to arrive on a new maritime aid corridor coming from Cyprus. We have more details in this report. A U.S. charity said Saturday its team in the war-ravaged Gaza Strip had finished unloading the first maritime aid shipment to reach the besieged territory. World Central Kitchen said in a statement that all cargo was offloaded and is being readied for distribution in Gaza, noting that the aid was almost 200 tons of food. The group is preparing a second boat of 240 tons of food to set sail from Cyprus, the starting point of a new maritime aid route across the eastern Mediterranean. Humanitarian effort is intended to mitigate food shortages that have prompted UN famine warnings in Gaza from the United Nations and aid workers. It added that the second shipment would also include a forklift and a crane to assist with the deliveries. Meanwhile, the Israeli military confirmed the first vessel operated by the Spanish charity Open Arms had arrived and said soldiers had been deployed to secure the area and conduct a security inspection. Military also said the delivery of humanitarian aid by sea did not constitute a breach of its years-long maritime blockade of Gaza. World Central Kitchen had to build a jetty southwest of Gaza City to deliver the aid. Israel's aggression has killed at least 31,490 people in Gaza, mostly women and children, according to the health ministry in the Hamas-run territory. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're now delighted to be joined over the telephone by our guest for this afternoon, His Excellency Ambassador Medhat Miligy, the former Assistant Foreign Minister. It's a very good afternoon to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Good afternoon to you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for joining us. And of course, the U.S. charity World Central Kitchen has announced that its team has finished unloading almost 200 tons of food, the first shipment to arrive on a new maritime aid corridor coming from Cyprus to Gaza. How do you see this new development, and what difference do you think it will make for the residents of Gaza?
Well, first of all, I think that this is going to be a very good step in the right direction, although that means that still Israel objects to the possibility of having land corridors to enter humanitarian aid to the starving population of Gaza. And that's what forces the United States, well, its closest ally, and actually the one that should really have a real pressure on Israel, actually showing how incapable they are to force Israel to accept opening any land corridors to the Palestinians. However, maritime will still enable us to enter more aid to the Palestinians than the airdrops that we used before. As you know, airdrops, besides its hazard cost, also it's limited quantities that could reach the people, and many of it actually were thrown to the sea and wasted in the sea.
Yes.
But with maritime channels, I think it's going to be much easier to enter more humanitarian aid.
Absolutely.
But we have to remember one thing, that actually all these resources that we are moving towards shows that Israel is still planning to continue its attacks on Gaza until the last south point, which is Rafah. We've heard before the Prime Minister and many Israeli officials that this war will not stop before achieving what it's described as its goals, which is the forced using the force to free the hostages on one side, and on the other hand, to destroy totally Hamas and all its cadres and so on. So this shows that if the United States is going to this point, that means that the war still continues after 160-something days.
Absolutely, Your Excellency, which leads me, to my next question about the stalled talks that are, aimed at securing a ceasefire in the war between Israel and Hamas, which are expected to restart on Sunday in Qatar. However, in light and in the middle of all of this, Netanyahu still goes ahead and approves attacks on Rafah. How do you see, this kind of two-sided approach to the conflict?
Well, it shows us that Netanyahu is still going on with his hysteric vengeance of what happened the 7th of October and the humiliation that the Israeli army was subjected to. And it shows to another point also that there is no real leverage from any of Israel's supporters on Israel to stop the genocide that is taking place. The 30+ thousand of martyrs, from which most of them were children and women and elderly people, did not actually provoke in all these supporters a serious call to end the war and or even threaten to stop arming of Israel. The arming of Israel, whether we are talking about new arms or ammunition, is still going according to plans. Nothing has been halted. And that shows that there is no serious pressure on Israel to stop its vengeance. As I said, it's a hysteric vengeance, and Israel do not want to understand that this is not in the interest of Israel itself. We are creating more of the, not just Hamas, any resistance movement to the occupation is going to be hardened because they don't see any other solution with the Israelis but to continue their resistance to free their country from the occupier, which will lead us to a circle of blood that will never end with what is going on. And unfortunately, as I said, the most important thing is to exert real pressure on Israel. This is not taking place. As we just saw, even the Americans cannot force Israel to open land corridors for the food to enter to the Palestinian starving population.
Indeed, Your Excellency. And even though there have been reports that the talks will resume, this time round, it is reported that the talks marks the first time both Israeli officials and Hamas leaders will be joining the indirect negotiations, and both sides have kind of made moves to get the talks back on track. How do you see? Do you have any hope for the upcoming talks? Do you see the two-staged talks or proposed agreement, the first stage being a 6-week ceasefire that would include releasing of hostages of women and children being held by Hamas in exchange for 700 to 1,000 Palestinian prisoners held in Israel, and a second stage where the two sides would declare a permanent ceasefire? Do you see this as hopeful news?
Well, it should be, actually. I mean, we should all consider this as a good starting point to serious negotiations between the two parties. But since the beginning of the war, we heard many dates and we heard many promises, and even President Biden himself at a certain point said clearly that the information he received from his national security advisor assured him that we will have a ceasefire before the beginning of Ramadan, which never took place. We are already ending the first week almost of Ramadan, and so far we haven't seen any serious consideration from the Israeli side to stop its raid. So far it's still going on, but the land invasion so far did not start. But we are hearing some talks that Israel will not stop there, and not just that. Actually, the position of the United States, according to the report, has changed from not to enter Gaza, to enter Rafah by all means, to that Israel should not enter Gaza without humanitarian aid, which means that the concept is agreed upon, which is something that is very scary to any person who realized the gravity of the situation and the humanitarian situation on the people of Gaza and on especially the civilians there. We've seen that they were the one who paid the maximum toll of the 6 weeks of, or even more, of the war ever since the 7th of October.
Yes.
They will still continue to be paying the highest price among the two parties, which are, I mean, the children and the women and the elderly people. We have to stop this by pressure. Israel will not stop without serious pressure, which so far most of the countries that are supporting Israel are reluctant to do, we have to say. And history will mark what we are talking about. They will not forget that they were accomplices to the genocide that is taking place in Gaza. We are talking mainly about the United States and the European allies of Israel, who are still supplying Israel with arms and diplomatic support, and still calling what is going on in Gaza as the Israeli right to defend itself, which is not the serious thing.
And even with the start of the holy month of Ramadan, you know, lots of people expected at least a pause in the aggression. However, this did not happen. Where do you see the role of the international organizations, for example, the United Nations Security Council, even though it has tried to take steps to, you know, stop these attacks on civilians, and the International Court of Justice as well, yet Israel seems to heed no warning?
Well, exactly. As you just said, I mean, Israel is not listening to anything. It's not listening to its closest allies. So do you think that it will listen to the international community? The international community has issued tens and dozens of resolutions against Israel that it has to respect the international law and the international humanitarian law that were always met with arrogance from the part of Israel, and it never conceded or even tried to comply with the international law. So how do we expect that the international organizations that have been hit by Israel and been struck by Israel on several occasions? We have over 150 of the UNRWA personnel were killed by the Israelis. Not just that, many European and American countries and America have stopped their funding to UNRWA only for allegation of 8 or 10 of its employees that were never proven. Israel never presented one single document to incriminate those 8 persons who represent 0.03% of the total number of workers with the UNRWA.
Yes.
But this provoked enough from the Western countries to suspend its funding to the organizations, which show to which extent that the international community and the international law will never be applied on Israel, unfortunately. This is the reality that we have to face. Unless they will exert serious power and serious pressure on Israel, it will never listen to the international law.
Absolutely. Finally, Your Excellency, now Benjamin Netanyahu said that he's approved a plan to attack you know, the city on the southern edge of the shattered Palestinian enclave, where more, you know, than half of the 2.3 million residents are sheltering after over 5 months of war. Global allies have urged Netanyahu to hold off on the attacks. Even Washington, the White House national security spokesperson, said the U.S. had not seen the Rafah plan, but would like to. How do you see their response?
Well, I can only say that although the pressure that is made by the public opinion in the West in general and in the United States, and showing the shift and the divergence of the positions between the public opinion and the street in these countries and the administration in the same countries, which shows that the general public is having a different point of view to this. But this pressure was never translated by the administrations, by the governments, to hold Israel responsible for the genocide that is taking place in Gaza. And because of that, the Israeli army will never stop before achieving the goals, just as Prime Minister Netanyahu has described this from the beginning. We will not accept defeat in this war before we totally dismantle Hamas. And in order to dismantle Hamas, he is totally destroying the Palestinian population and committing a genocide according to all humanitarian organizations that have described it as a genocide and as a war crime. But was this deter Israel in any way? Unfortunately, it did not so far. The only thing that will convince Israel is when it sees that its interests are threatened by a serious accusation from the United States that will be coupled with a hold of armament or shipping of arms to Israel and ammunition and all kinds of diplomatic support. Without this, then we don't really stand a chance, and the genocide will continue because the world is turning a blind eye to what's taking place in Gaza.
Indeed. Right. I'd like to thank you very, very much, Your Excellency, Ambassador Medhat Miligy, the former Assistant Foreign Minister. Thank you very much, sir, for your time and your insight on today's edition of Arab Affairs. And still with news from Gaza, Israeli aggression continues across the Strip for the 162nd day in a row, leaving scores of Palestinians dead. In the same context, the Ministry of Health in Gaza announced 36 Palestinians, including women and children, died in an Israeli strike on a house sheltering evacuees in Nusayrat in central Gaza. Ministry added 123 Palestinians were also shot dead by Israelis, an Israeli fire overnight across Gaza. Stalled talks aimed at securing a ceasefire in the war between Israel and Hamas are expected to restart in Qatar as soon as Sunday. Talks would mark the first time both Israeli officials and Hamas leaders joined the indirect negotiations since the start of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. In recent days, however, both sides have made moves aimed at getting the talks, which never fully broke off, back on track. According to sources, Hamas have given mediators a new proposal for a three-stage plan that would end the fighting. The first stage would be a 6-week ceasefire that would include the release of hostages of women and children, the ill and elderly being held by Hamas in Gaza, in exchange for 700 to 1,000 Palestinian prisoners being held by Israel. A date for the total withdrawal will also be announced after the completion of the first stage. In the second phase, the two sides would declare a permanent ceasefire, and Hamas would free the remaining Israeli soldiers held hostage in exchange for more prisoners. Meanwhile, Israel has approved a potential assault on the Gaza city of Rafah, whilst also keeping ceasefire hopes alive, with plans to send another delegation to Qatar for the talks on the possible hostage deal with Hamas. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said he'd approved a plan to attack the city on the southern edge of the shattered Palestinian enclave, where more than half of its 2.3 million residents are sheltering after 5 months of war. Global allies and critics have urged Netanyahu to hold off attacking Rafah, fearing mass civilian casualties. However, Israel claimed it is one of the last strongholds of Hamas, who it has pledged to eliminate, and residents will be evacuated. Meanwhile, in Washington, the White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby said the U.S. had not seen the Rafah plan, but would like to. Moving to other news from the Arab region, the United Nations called for Sudan's warring factions to provide unimpeded access for the desperately needed aid as the specter of famine looms after nearly a year of conflict. We have the details in this report. The United Nations appealed for Sudan's battling factions to allow delivery of humanitarian relief to fend off looming catastrophic hunger. According to a UN document, some 5 million Sudanese could face severe food insecurity in the coming months as a nearly year-long war between rival generals continues to tear the country apart. The war between the army chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and his former deputy Mohammed Hamdan Daglo has since April last year killed tens of thousands of people, destroyed infrastructure and crippled the economy. It has also triggered a dire shortage of humanitarian aid as well as food and acute food shortages, with the country teetering on the brink of famine. Noting that some 18 million Sudanese are already facing acute food insecurity, a record during harvest season. UN humanitarian chief Martin Griffiths warned in a letter to the Security Council that almost 5 million people could slip into catastrophic food insecurity in some parts of the country in the coming months. He noted that nearly 730,000 Sudanese children, including more than 240,000 in Darfur, are thought to suffer from severe malnutrition. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' spokesperson, Stéphane Dujarric, said the aid organizations require safe, rapid, sustained, and unimpeded access, including across conflict lines within Sudan. The UN's World Food Programme has warned that the war risks triggering the world's largest hunger crisis. Jill Lawler, emergency chief in Sudan for the UN Children's Agency UNICEF, said there were enough aid stocks in Port Sudan, but the problem was getting the aid from there to the people in need.